She was only 12 years old when she was forced to marry an old rich man to save her sick brother. But on her wedding night, instead of the peace she expected, her eyes saw a secret as horrifying as she could have ever imagined. What happened when a girl who had left herself in the hands of fate learned the truth about her husband? And why did this story change the fate of not only her, but millions of other people? In a remote, dusty village where every day was a struggle against the unyielding grip of poverty and fate, lived a 12-year-old girl named Maria. The modest home of the Scott family sat on the fringes of a parched landscape, where the cracked earth told stories of hardship, and the sparse trees, bent by relentless winds, whispered secrets of survival. Maria's world was painted in faded hues, the brown of dried earth, the dull blue of a sky burdened by sorrow, and the muted palette of ragged clothing that bore the wear of many long, trying days. Maria's family was no stranger to hardship. Her mother, with gentle eyes and hands carved by years of labor, worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, tending to a small garden and mending what little wear and tear the modest dwelling might suffer. Her father, once a proud man with sturdy dreams, had been worn down by years of failing harvests and the constant burden of paying debts to unscrupulous moneylenders. Yet amid these hardships, the one pain that sharpened every moment into torment was the grave illness that had ravaged Maria's only younger brother, Thomas. Tiny Thomas, barely 5 years old, lay in a cramped corner of their home, his frail body besieged by a persistent fever and a cough that broke the silence of night. Doctors in the nearby town offered few comforting words. His condition was dire, and the treatments were as expensive as they were scarce. Each morning, as the first feeble light of dawn crept over the horizon, Maria rose with a heart heavy with responsibility far beyond her tender years. With the sun barely peeking through the threadbare curtains, she would slip into her fraying dress and set out barefoot on the narrow, unpaved road that wound through the village. In her small hands, she carried a basket filled with vibrant oranges, a rare burst of color amid the drab monotony of Ropit. These oranges, grown in a meager orchard on the outskirts of the village, were the family's most precious commodity. They were not only a source of meager income, but also a symbol of hope for Maria. Each sale was a small promise that she could help secure the funds needed for Thomas's medicine and care. The village market was a cacophony of sounds and smells, the raucous barter of neighbors, the pungent aroma of spiced street food, blending with the dusty air and the constant murmur of hardship interwoven with resilience. As Maria navigated the crowded lanes, her eyes, large and earnest, darted from stall to stall. She greeted sleepy vendors with a shy smile and pleaded with passing customers, her voice trembling with both hope and the desperation of youth. Every few coins that clinked into her calloused palms seemed imbued with the potential to lift a small part of her family from the clutches of despair, if only for a fleeting moment. Yet, even as she sold her oranges, Maria's mind was constantly shadowed by worry. At home, her mother would be pacing the creaking wooden floor, anxiously whispering prayers for a miracle, while her father stared blankly out of the cracked window, his eyes lost in memories of better times. And in the dim, somber room where young Thomas lay, the fragile sound of his labored breathing was a daily reminder of life's cruel unpredictability. In those quiet, desperate hours of the night, when the world was cloaked in darkness and the weight of poverty pressed in like a relentless tide, Maria's childhood was stripped to its bare bones, a perpetual balancing act between tenderness and the stark demands of survival. Though only 12, Maria possessed a wisdom that seemed forged in the crucible of hardship. She had learned early on that life on the edge demanded sacrifices and unwelcome choices. Her gentle heart was tempered by a steeled resolve to protect the ones she loved, even if it meant sacrificing her own dreams and innocence. Every orange she sold, every coin earned, was measured against the cost of hope, the hope that one day maybe the cruel cycle of poverty and illness might break, and Thomas might be free from the shadow of sickness that darkened their days. Unbeknownst to Maria, fate had already laid the groundwork for a decision that would rewrite the course of her life. In whispered conversations in the back alleys of the village, murmurs of an opportunity, a deal forged in desperation, had begun to circulate. An old, wealthy man, known in hushed tones for his vast fortune and mysterious ways, had been seen on the outskirts of the community. He approached families with promises of riches and salvation, but his bargains always came with strings attached, like the cruel talons of a predatory hawk. Rumor had it that such a man was desperate to secure a marriage alliance that would imbue his wealth with a semblance of legitimacy. In a village where choices were few and the price of survival was steep, such an offer, terrifying as it might be, glimmered like a dangerous lifeline. For Maria's family, ensnared by the unbearable cost of Thomas's care, these whispers grew into a terrifying certainty. The stark reality was that their only way out of the relentless grip of poverty might be to accept the unthinkable, to send their beloved daughter into a life that was not hers. Life of servitude and sacrifice, in exchange for the wealth that might pay for Thomas's care and their uncertain future. And so, as Maria wove through the bustling market, every coin in her small basket carried not only the weight of immediate need, but also the heavy promise of a fate that would change everything she knew about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of freedom. That very evening, as twilight surrendered to a deep, brooding night over the parched village, an unexpected knock at the door shattered the fragile calm within the Scott household. Maria's mother, Anna, opened the creaking door to reveal a stranger unlike anyone they had seen before, a hunched, dignified man with silvery hair and eyes that glittered with both promise and calculation. Dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of wealth and authority, the old man introduced himself as Mr. Harold Wexley, a prosperous merchant known in distant towns for his vast fortune and it was whispered, questionable reputation. His presence exuded an aura of quiet dominance, and every step he took seemed measured, as if deliberate in its purpose. Inside their humble parlor, where the worn furniture and threadbare rugs bore testament to years of struggle, Mr. Wexley was offered a seat. His piercing gaze swept over the room and finally rested on Anna and her husband, Samuel, a man whose lined face reflected sorrow and resignation from endless hardships. The air grew heavy even as the conversation began, the old man's measured tone blending with the low murmur of the wind outside. "Good evening, Mr. Wexley," intoned slowly, his voice smooth but laced with an unmistakable edge. "I come bearing an offer that I believe may bring you relief from your burdens." He paused, as if to let the weight of his words sink in. His eyes flitted briefly to the small portrait of young Thomas, the frail boy lying somberly in another room, and then deliberately shifted to Maria, who stood silently in the corner, her wide eyes betraying both curiosity and quiet dread. Samuel, whose heart was heavy with debt and hopelessness, pressed his calloused fingers together. "We do not ask for charity," he began shakily, "but our circumstances leave us little choice when the matter of our son's life hangs in the balance." Anna, her eyes glistening with silent tears, nodded in agreement. Their voices were soft and broken, each word laden with the unspoken agony of watching a child suffer when every possible remedy seemed out of reach. Mr. Wexley leaned forward, his well-manicured hands clasped neatly before him. "I understand your plight," he said. "For a price I can offer you the means to secure your son's medicine, to ensure that young Thomas receives proper care. However, every boon has its cost, and I am not without my own needs." His gaze flickered with subtle intensity as he continued, "I am prepared to provide in exchange for your daughter's hand in marriage." A pregnant silence fell over the room. The air seemed to crackle with incredulity. Maria's heart pounded fiercely. She had been too young to grasp the full implications of the conversation, yet the trepidation in her eyes was unmistakable, even to a 12-year-old. Samuel's face contorted in anguish. His voice wavered as he murmured, "Our daughter? But she is so young." Anna's eyes shone with bitter tears as she struggled to balance a mother's fierce love with the unbearable truth of their reality. "It is our only way," she whispered hoarsely. "For her innocence is the price we must sometimes pay to save our child." In that moment, the tight coil of desperation in the room expanded into a full, agonizing resignation. The prospect was unthinkable. Maria, with her gentle smile and promising youth, being forced into a union with a man 70 years her senior. But the magnitude of Thomas's suffering made choices disappear into the realm of impossibility. Mr. Wexley's voice was calm, almost soothing, as he detailed the terms of the agreement. "I have the means and the influence to transform your fortunes. In exchange for Maria's hand, I shall bestow upon you sufficient wealth to end all your struggles. Your debts will vanish, your son's medical expenses will be covered, and your family will be taken care of." He spoke as if reciting an unalterable fact. His words resonated with the finality of a contract that was already sealed by fate. In the days that followed, the offer loomed over the Scott family like a predatory shadow. Samuel and Anna convened in long, tearful discussions by the dim light of a tallow candle. They debated in hushed tones with furrowed brows and trembling hands. How could they sacrifice the very essence of their daughter Maria for the sake of her brother? Yet the relentless cost of Thomas's care, the mounting bills and the peril of losing him to an illness that thrived in poverty, left them with scant alternatives. Every evening as the winds howled against their fragile home, their sorrow deepened, and the dreadful reality became inescapable. There was no other way. One baleful morning, with the sky a dismal slate above the village, the decision was delivered in the tearful eyes of Maria's parents. In the sterile confines of a hurried meeting at the modest town hall, they formally agreed to Mr. Wexley's terms. They too believed that by relinquishing their beloved daughter to an arranged, merciless marriage, they might salvage a future for Thomas, a future in which hope could be rekindled amid despair. In that moment, as heavy as the weight of the desert itself, the contract was sealed with a shaking handshake, and the fate of 12-year-old Maria was irrevocably changed. Maria, barely comprehending the full gravity of what had been arranged, felt as if the world was splitting in two. Her mind swirled with images of a future robbed of childhood innocence and bright promise. Yet, amid the swirling tears and the muffled protests of her spirit, she understood that there lay no alternative. The desperate love of her family left her no room to refuse. With trembling acceptance, Maria's gaze lifted slowly, and in that silent moment, she surrendered herself to a destiny not of her choosing. That fateful day had passed in a blur of muted sorrow and resigned duty, a day on which the unthinkable had been decided, altering the life of 12-year-old Maria irrevocably. As twilight surrendered to the heavy, oppressive darkness of night, the sounds of the village faded into a distant murmur. Now, in the cold stillness of her new home, Maria was to experience the beginning of a life she had never imagined. A life forged not by her own dreams, but by the desperate choices of those who loved her. The evening of the wedding was a solemn affair. In a ceremony held more out of necessity than celebration, Maria had been led through the ritual with trembling steps. The faces around her were somber, her parents' eyes filled with despair and hopeless duty, while even the few local witnesses averted their gaze from the painful truth that power and wealth had come to determine the fates of the vulnerable. That night, as prescribed by custom and coercion, Maria was escorted to the bridal chamber of the old mansion that belonged to her new husband, a mansion dark with secrets and shadowed by the weight of untold crimes. The room into which she was led seemed as forbidding as it was vast. Heavy velvet curtains, drawn tightly against the chill outside, dimly filtered the flickering light of a single oil lamp. The ornate furniture, relics of a bygone era of opulence, stood as mute witnesses to years of power and cruelty. It was here, in the oppressive silence, that Maria sensed the overwhelming gulf between the life she had known and the future thrust upon her. The customary expectations for the wedding night, a time meant for consummation and union, felt to Maria like an ominous rite, marking the beginning of a bondage she could neither understand nor escape. In the haze of forced compliance and the confusion of her tender years, Maria's attention was drawn away from the ritualistic proceedings by a curious, almost imperceptible sound, a metallic clink, and the soft rustle of paper echoing from behind a partially open door at the far end of the chamber. Driven by a mixture of fear, loneliness, and a nascent spark of rebellion, she crept silently across the cold stone floor, her bare feet careful not to betray her presence. Clutched in her small hand was a single trembling candle that cast fragile, flickering shadows upon the walls. Peering around the doorframe, she discovered a narrow corridor that led to what appeared to be her husband's private study. The air there carried the faint odor of old tobacco and something acrid, an unmistakable, unsettling tang of decay and corruption. With heart pounding and hands shaking, Maria pushed the door open further. What she found inside made her blood run cold, etching the beginning of a desperate new chapter into her soul. The study was a bizarre mixture of lavish decor and grim evidence of unspeakable transgressions. Stacks of ledgers and brittle documents were haphazardly piled on a heavy, dark oak desk. Oil lamps threw long, distorted shadows across dusty barrels and locked chests that looked as if they had guarded secrets for decades. Among these items, Maria's trembling eyes caught sight of a collection of photographs and incriminating files bound in worn leather, a collection that bore witness to her husband's empire of wealth. As she skimmed the fragile pages with her youthful, uncomprehending fingers, the horrific truth began to take shape. The documents detailed transactions and deals that were far removed from any honest trade. There were records of illicit agreements, exploitative contracts with desperate laborers, and even evidence suggesting involvement in grave injustices committed against those who had been powerless and voiceless. It was as if every piece of paper in the study was a testament to a dark legacy, one in which cruelty and corruption had become the cornerstones of his fortune. Maria's innocent eyes widened in disbelief. The very foundation of his vast wealth was built not on honest commerce, but on a series of vicious transgressions and moral debts. The shock was overwhelming. Here, in the silent gloom of the study, Maria realized that the old man to whom she had been forced was not merely a wealthy benefactor, but a man whose entire life was entwined with cruelty, a man who had economically and morally exploited the misery of countless people. Every line of text, every carefully recorded number in those ledgers, spoke of exploitation and secrets that had been kept hidden behind the facade of opulent business dealings. This was not the legacy of a benevolent benefactor offering salvation. It was the legacy of a tyrant whose hidden deeds stained the very soul of his empire. In that horrifying moment, Maria's world shifted. The weight of the secret, so monstrous and malign, pressed down on her fragile heart. Her mind reeled with the realization that the man who was now her husband had woven this extensive web of injustice, a web that ensnared the very people whose lives she had known in her impoverished village. The tender hope that perhaps this marriage might lead to salvation for her sick brother was now sullied by the grim truth that her union would make her complicit in his dark dealings. The secret that spilled forth from those brittle pages was enough to shatter every semblance of trust or promise. It was a revelation that twisted her understanding of power, wealth, and fate into something terrifyingly unrecognizable. Tears, unbidden and bitter, welled in Maria's eyes as she backed away from the study, the candle's trembling flame mirroring the tumult within her. The wedding night, once anticipated as a curious turning point, had instead become the crucible in which her determination was forged. In that dark, suffocating moment, Maria vowed silently that the horror she had uncovered would not be the end of her story. Though trapped by circumstances that had robbed her of freedom and childhood, she resolved to one day harness this knowledge, a weapon perhaps, powerful enough to overturn the cruel legacy that had condemned her to this fate. As the distant murmur of the wedding festivities faded behind her, Maria clutched the secret close to her heart. The dreadful knowledge of her husband's true nature would become the spark for a future rebellion, a future in which her own strength and dignity, and those of countless others forced into similar bonds, might one day reclaim a stolen destiny. In that long, agonizing night, Maria's tear-streaked face held not only sorrow and terror, but also the first glimmer of defiance, a silent promise that she would find a way to transform her dark inheritance into the catalyst for a revolution of justice and renewal. In the quiet, hours after that horrific discovery in the study, Maria's trembling hands continued to trace over the brittle pages of the documents, as if the very touch of those incriminating records could imprint upon her soul the truth of the man to whom she now belonged. The dim light of the oil lamp seemed to expose every secret, vast ledgers containing coded entries of bribes, exploitative labor contracts signed in blood and fear, and names of people, farmers, street vendors, even local village laborers, whose lives had been bartered away for quick profit. With each word she read, the weight of her predicament grew heavier. This was not the benign business of a harmless rich man, but a sprawling system of corruption and cruelty, one that had drained the lifeblood of her community and many others like it. As the night deepened, Maria's mind swirled with conflicting emotions. Horror battled with determination inside her, the tender hope that had compelled her family to make that unthinkable bargain with Mr. Wexley was now corroded by the knowledge that the wealth promised came at a disastrous human cost. Every manipulated transaction and every unsigned signature in those ledgers was a testament to injustice. In that oppressive silence, Maria resolved that she could not, in good conscience, allow herself to be forever bound to a life built on the suffering of others. Over the following days, while her new husband paraded his public persona of dignified generosity as he attended lavish functions and made business appearances, Maria began to steal into the private corners of his sprawling estate. Disguised by the monotony of her daily chores and the invisibility granted to a young girl in a gilded cage, she started to explore places that should have remained hidden. Secret passageways behind heavy draperies in corridors, locked rooms in the depths of his study, and even the attic that smelled of old money and older sins. Each space revealed more disturbing evidence of a man who sustained his fortune by crushing hopes and lives. In one dusty, forgotten safe tucked away behind a portrait in a dim corridor, Maria uncovered further correspondence, letters written in secret code between her husband and influential figures in neighboring towns. The contents painted a damning picture of a network of despair, fraudulent schemes in which impoverished families were manipulated, indigenous people were exploited, and every look of kindness in the village was countered by the cold calculation of profit. These messages spoke of clandestine meetings in smoky back rooms and of deals sealed with threats and intimidation rather than a handshake. Every word echoed in her soul, transforming her fear into a burning resolve to reclaim her life and the dignity of all those ruined by his actions. The more Maria learned, the more the reality of her situation settled around her like chains. This marriage, which had been forced upon her for the supposed salvation of her ailing brother, was nothing less than a gilded prison built on the bones of corruption. Yet in that prison, the seed of defiance had taken root. Each new piece of incriminating evidence accumulated in her heart, as both a tragedy and a tool, a weapon for change if she could gather the strength to wield it. Maria began to question everything she had ever known about sacrifice and salvation. Had her family's desperate decision not only doomed her to a life of sorrow, but inadvertently set her on the path to dismantle the very system that preyed upon the vulnerable? Though still a child, Maria's innate intuition whispered to her that secrecy was power. In solitary moments, hidden away from prying eyes, she began to safeguard the documents and write down her own observations about the corruption she had discovered. She fashioned a small, clandestine ledger of her own, meticulously noting dates, names, and the whispered promises of retribution that she overheard from muffled voices in the mansion's halls. Every detail became a piece of a dangerous puzzle, one that, if reassembled, might one day expose the full extent of Mr. Wexley's machinations. The days grew into weeks, and with them came small signs that Maria's quiet vigilance was not going unnoticed by the deeper currents of the household. Occasionally, when no one else was looking, a servant would meet her gaze with a subtle, sorrowful nod, a silent acknowledgement that even under the heavy hand of oppression, truths did not remain buried forever. In hushed whispers among the lower ranks of the estate's staff, rumors circulated about the true origin of Mr. Wexley's wealth. It seemed that others had long suspected that his fortune was tainted, yet none had dared to confront the monstrous reality. Now, through Maria's determined exploration, those suspicions were gaining substance. In one particular late afternoon, when the heat draped the estate in a languid haze, Maria overheard a conversation between two middle-aged men, a conversation punctuated by low laughter and bitter sighs. They spoke of clandestine shipments, of bribed officials, and of the ruin that awaited any family daring to oppose his methods. Their words sent a chill through her. Not only did they validate her worst fears, but they also underscored the perilous situation in which she found herself. This man, whose hand she had been forced to take, was not a guardian, even in the guise of wealth, but a master of a cruel empire that fed on desperation. Despite her terror, a newfound determination began to rise within Maria. The evidence was clear. She was trapped in a web of injustice that extended far beyond the confines of a forced marriage. And yet, as oppressive as this web was, it also provided her with the raw material to fight back. She began to plot quietly in her mind, a plan that would require all the cunning and courage she could muster, despite her tender age. The secret she now possessed was both a burden and a beacon. If she could find a way to utilize this damning knowledge, perhaps she could not only secure her own freedom, but also spark a movement that would upend the long-standing tyranny that had for too long dictated the fate of the poor and the powerless. Every night, as darkness blanketed the estate, Maria stared out through a small window where the night sky twinkled indifferently above, pondering the choices before her. The horrifying legacy of her husband's wealth was both a poison and a potential catalyst for change. Would she, a mere 12-year-old girl forged in the fires of unimaginable sacrifice, be able to harness the very corruption that sought to control her life and turn it into a weapon for justice? The challenge loomed immense, yet deep within her, an ember of fierce resolve began to glow, an ember that promised that one day the truths documented in secret ledgers would ignite a revolution of hope and liberation. In the weeks following the harrowing discovery in the study, Maria's once quiet nights grew restless with the pulse of a secret purpose. The weight of her husband's corrupt empire pressed on her soul, but in that very pressure she found the spark of resistance. Every hidden ledger and whispered document had revealed the cruelty upon which his fortune was built. And as the silent corridors of the mansion concealed whispers of deceit and exploitation, Maria began crafting a plan, a quiet, clandestine rebellion that would use his dark legacy as the foundation for her own uprising. By day, Maria dutifully carried out her prescribed tasks, appearing obedient and unremarkable in the eyes of those who served him. Yet beneath the veneer of submissive silence, she spent stolen moments in the shadows, meeting with trusted servants and sympathetic staff. In hushed conversations in the narrow back hallways and behind the heavy draperies, she discovered that many had long suffered under the yoke of injustice, their hopes snuffed out by the oppressive weight of his rule. There was Elena, the kindly cook whose family had been reduced to begging for scraps. Jacob, the stable hand whose son had been forced into labor in distant, dangerous fields, and even a few older ladies whose life stories were etched with betrayal and exploitation. They too bore silent scars, and each was eager for change. Under the cover of candlelight in a forgotten storeroom, Maria began to share her secret ledger. With trembling yet determined voice, she recounted every detail she had uncovered, from the forged contracts that had stripped honest people of their lands to the coded orders that had sanctioned unspeakable acts of cruelty. The group listened in rapt silence, horror and resolve mingling in their eyes. What they heard was not merely evidence of one man's misdeeds, but a tapestry of oppression that had affected every corner of their small world. It was this gathering of misfits and undervalued souls that marked the birth of a movement, one that would soon spread like wildfire among the downtrodden. In secret meetings, Maria took on the role of both student and leader. Though just a child, her clarity of purpose and the raw truth of her discovery lent her a quiet authority. She began organizing plans for small acts of defiance, a way to subvert the very mechanisms that had kept them silent for so long. Her first act of rebellion was to secretly redistribute some of the wealth stealthily. She pilfered minor documents and funds from overlooked drawers and safes, pooling them into a hidden cache that could be used to aid families desperately in need. Every coin she diverted was a small, symbolic victory against an empire built on exploitation. Maria also used her growing network to spread word among local families that had long suffered in silence. In discreet visits and whispered counseling sessions held under the cover of twilight, She urged them to document their own hardships and to keep careful records of every injustice committed by her husband's agents. These records, she explained, would not only serve as testimony to their suffering, but would eventually be the ammunition for their collective uprising. With quiet determination, she taught them to look for patterns in how debts were forced, how labor was exploited, and how promises were broken. Each piece of evidence was a seed that, if nurtured, had the power to blossom into outrage against the pervasive injustice. Despite her small stature and tender age, Maria's resolve was already unsettling to the corridors of power. In hushed boardrooms and the silent offices of the estate, whispers began to spread among Mr. Wexley's senior aides. Rumors of a rising influence, a spectral presence orchestrating discontent from within, stirred unease in the minds of those who had long enjoyed unchecked authority. The old man himself remained blissfully unaware of the coup simmering beneath the surface. His hubris allowed him to believe that his wealth and iron grip would forever silence dissent. Yet every furtive glance, every coded message passed secretly among the servants, slowly chipped away at his invincible facade. Maria, acutely aware that open rebellion would bring swift and brutal retaliation, chose instead to work in layers. She began by reaching out to sympathetic neighbors in the village, speaking in low tones at the market stalls and roadside corners. Carefully, she shared her vision, a movement that would use the very evidence of his corruption to fuel demands for justice and reform. Families once resigned to their suffering started to express cautious hope. They began whispering of forming alliances with one another, a united front of villagers, servants, and oppressed workers, to demand accountability for the crimes that had enslaved them. In secret correspondence, scribbled letters passed discreetly between trusted hands. Maria outlined plans for protest, for petitions to be sent to distant regional authorities, and even for a covert strike among the laborers forced to toil under impossible conditions. Every message was a thread in what would become a tapestry of rebellion. Though her words were simple, they carried an unyielding promise. The time for silent suffering was over, and a new era was on the horizon. Late at night, when the chill of darkness blanketed the estate, Maria would sit by a small window in her cramped quarters and gaze at the star-studded sky above. In that vast, indifferent tableau of the cosmos, she drew strength. Each star seemed to whisper of hope. A small light in the vast darkness, much like the spark of rebellion, kindled within her. The horrors of her marriage and the cruelty of his empire fueled her desire for retribution, not with violence, but with the power of truth. The scandalous documents, carefully hidden in the folds of her secret ledger, would become the ammunition to unmask the tyrant's crimes once and for all. Thus, in that precarious balance between fear and hope, the seeds of rebellion were sown. Maria's extraordinary uprising was already taking root in the hearts of those who had been silenced for generations. With every clandestine meeting, every shared sacrifice, and every determined smile exchanged in the shadows, she was shaping the future, a future where the oppressed would rise, and where a 13-year-old girl's courage would reverberate through the ages. In the days that followed her secret rebellion's humble beginnings, Maria's covert operations began to gather momentum as surely as the pale light of dawn scatters the lingering darkness. Every whispered conversation, every furtive exchange of documents, every coded note passed among the oppressed servants and villagers served as a brick in the slowly emerging foundation of a movement that would eventually shake the very pillars of her husband's corrupt empire. Late one stifling evening, with the humid air heavy with anticipation, Maria managed to summon together a small but resolute circle of trusted allies in a forgotten storeroom deep within the mansion's labyrinthine corridors. There, by the light of a single sputtering lantern, she spread out the damning documents she had meticulously gathered. Ledgers that recorded shameless bribery, exploitative labor contracts that had stripped local families of their dignity, and correspondence detailing secret meetings with officials whose names were whispered in fear throughout the region. Her small voice, quivering with both raw emotion and burgeoning determination, began to recite the truths buried within these brittle pages. "My friends," she said softly, eyes fierce beyond her tender age. What you see here is not merely the scandal of one man. It is a record of cruelty, a ledger of sorrow written in the names of our people. Every number, every signature, and every coded word reveals how our lives have been forfeit to his greed. He masked his crimes behind a veneer of wealth and privilege, using our suffering to fill his coffers. But tonight we have gathered proof that can expose him to our world. Her words fell on a somber silence, punctuated only by the distant thud of a guard's boot on stone outside. Elena, the kindly cook whose own family had suffered unspeakably at his hands, wiped a tear from her weathered cheek as she murmured, "So many of us have trusted a man whose riches were built on our misery. We must reclaim what has been taken from us." Jacob, the quiet, stable hand, nodded grimly, his eyes burning with a resolve that belied his gentle nature. Even the oldest among them, a servant whose lifetime of muted endurance had made him all too familiar with injustice, offered a rasping approval as he whispered, "It is time we break these chains." In that cramped, secret room, Maria set forth a plan that was as intricate as it was perilous. She would compile her own clandestine ledger, a chronicle of every injustice, every corrupt transaction, every act of cruelty committed by the man who now held her hand in marriage. Her strategy was threefold. First, to use the gravely incriminating documents she had uncovered to assemble indisputable evidence of his misdeeds. Second, to covertly pass this evidence to sympathetic officials and trustworthy members of the community who secretly longed for change. And third, to mobilize the oppressed women, laborers, and the shattered families of the village to demand accountability for years of exploitation. Over the next several days, Maria worked tirelessly in the shadow of the mansion's imposing facade. By day, she performed the tasks expected of her in the gilded prison of her forced role, all the while secretly transcribing key details from the incriminating documents into a hidden diary. In the quiet hours of early morning, when the estate lay hushed and vulnerable against the pre-dawn chill, she slipped out to the barren fields behind the mansion to meet discreetly with local villagers. There, beneath the wide, indifferent sky, she shared her discoveries with families whose own lives had been derailed by her husband's cruel enterprises. With whispered urgency and trembling conviction, she explained how every forged signature, every manipulated contract, was a concrete link in the unholy chain that bound them all. One chilly night, while rain drummed softly upon corrugated tin roofs in the village, Maria and a trusted friend, a school teacher named Rosa, whose quiet defiance had long inspired local youth, gathered in a cramped room of a rundown inn. Over the crackle of a small kerosene lamp, Maria laid bare the truth recorded in her secret diary. "This isn't just about me," she insisted, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "It is about every mother who has seen her child starve, every laborer who has been forced to bow under unfair debts, every human soul that has been crushed beneath the weight of these unjust contracts. We must stand together and demand that the truth be known." Rosa's eyes flashed with determination as she replied, "We must deliver this message far and wide. We need to contact honest officials, journalists, anyone who can help unravel this network of corruption. Our silence has prolonged our suffering for too long." With this charge, an unspoken promise was forged amongst those gathered, a promise that the truth, once revealed, would light the way toward retribution and reform. Maria's resolve deepened with every passing hour, even as the risks grew ever more acute. Rumors began to circulate among the estate's servile staff, rumors that a young girl had been seen lingering near the most guarded areas, secretly gathering envoys of dissent. The mansion's atmosphere grew tense, and even the old man, Mr. Wexley, started to sense tremors beneath the bedrock of his carefully constructed empire. His aides whispered anxiously about anomalies in the nightly accounts, unexplained gaps in the ledgers, and the subtle, yet persistent murmur of discontent from the lower ranks. Determined not to allow fear to eclipse her mission, Maria arranged a final, decisive step. Under cover of a moonless night, she entrusted her assembled evidence, a meticulously bound compendium of every dark transaction, to a network of trusted couriers. Disguised as ordinary servants, These brave souls would carry the documents to sympathetic officials in a nearby district, where an independent magistrate was known for his incorruptible sense of justice. Every moment was fraught with dread, for being discovered would mean certain retribution. Yet the flame of rebellion that Maria had kindled burned too fiercely to be quenched by threats alone. As the evidence left the confines of the mansion, a palpable shift rippled through the oppressed ranks. The network of dissent, once a collection of broken whispers, rose in unison, a low, determined murmur that promised a revolution of justice. In secret gatherings, women who had suffered in silence began to share stories of their own oppression. Men, once cowed by the suffocating grip of corruption, stirred to life with the promise of liberation. The dark empire built on misery was beginning to crumble beneath the weight of its own moral bankruptcy. At the same time, the corridors of power beyond the estate slowly became aware of the scandal. Whispers reached the ears of regional magistrates and reporters who had long suspected that Mr. Wexley's fortune was tainted by criminality. The seeds of inquiry were sown, as the newly unlocked chain of evidence threatened to expose decades of inequity hidden within meticulously kept financial ledgers. And while Maria's own journey was only just beginning, the movement that she had ignited was already taking on a life of its own, a force that promised to change the lives of thousands oppressed by the same ruthless system. Late one night, as Maria lay awake on a narrow cot in the servants' quarters, each creak of the wooden floor echoing like the distant beat of a war drum, she allowed herself a moment of quiet resolve. In the still darkness, her heart swelled with the fearsome confidence of one who has seen the abyss and chosen to rise against it. The path ahead was treacherous, lined with peril and betrayal, but armed with the truth, she was no longer a helpless girl forced into silence. She was the bearer of an inescapable revelation, the spark that could ignite the flames of change. As the months passed, the tremors of rebellion that Maria had ignited grew into a resounding roar that echoed far beyond the cold stone walls of her ensnaring mansion. What had begun as furtive whispers among the servants and secret meetings in forgotten corridors had blossomed into a movement that spanned the entire region, the damning evidence that Maria had risked everything to compile and share, every ledger recording illicit deals, every coded memorandum of exploitation, was now in the hands of incorruptible magistrates and resolute journalists. Investigations were launched, and the oppressive network built by Mr. Wexley began to crumble under the relentless weight of the truth. It started on an overcast day when a convoy of government officials and law enforcement agents descended upon the estate. The long-hidden secrets of the corrupt empire were thrown into the harsh light of public scrutiny, and one by one, indictments were issued. Mr. Wexley's loyal aides, who had once whispered in trembling corridors about the threat of a rogue child stirring dissent, were arrested for their roles in the vast network of abuse and exploitation. The majestic mansion, once a symbol of unchecked power and wealth acquired at the expense of the helpless, was transformed into a stage for justice, a place where the dark chapters of its history would finally be exposed. For Maria, who had been forced into this cursed union at such an unimaginable age, the unfolding events were both a vindication and an end to one painful chapter of her life. With the collapse of her husband's empire, the shackles of her personal prison began to loosen. In the wake of the legal uproar, the old man was tried and condemned not merely for financial crimes, but for an extensive array of human rights abuses. His arrogance, once cloaked in opulence, had been laid bare for all to see, and the public outcry that followed became the catalyst for sweeping reforms that would protect countless others from suffering similar fates. As the weight of injustice lifted, Maria's role among the people transformed in ways that defied the very circumstances that had once nearly crushed her spirit. In the aftermath of the scandal, leaders from every corner of the community, settlers, laborers, and once whispered members of the oppressed indigenous groups, came together not in anger alone, but with a steadfast desire for rebuilding a just society. Maria, whose courage and perseverance had sparked the transformation, soon found herself recognized not as a victim of circumstance, but as a symbol of hope and rebellion. Despite having been forced into a marriage that was meant to secure a future for her ailing brother, Maria's destiny had outgrown the cruel bargain imposed upon her, with the spoils of the old man's ill-gotten wealth, now rightfully seized and earmarked for public good. The people set about creating institutions that would champion the rights of the downtrodden. Under Maria's quiet guidance, a grassroots organization was established to fight for the rights of women and children, to ensure that no other innocent soul would be sacrificed at the altar of greed. She organized legal aid for families wronged by corrupt businessmen and set up educational programs for those who had been left voiceless by poverty. In community halls and open-air gatherings, their story was recounted as the tale of a courageous young girl who, against impossible odds, had revealed the rot at the heart of a tyrannical system. In time, the movement inspired by Maria's bravery grew into a formidable force. Protest marches and peaceful sit-ins brought attention to issues that had long festered behind closed doors, and new laws were enacted to protect vulnerable populations. Maria, once forced into a life of submission, became a revered advocate for justice, a living embodiment of the possibility of transformation. People from every stratum of society gathered at rallies, carrying signs that read "From silence to strength," and "Our voice is our power." Each protest, each act of solidarity, was a testament to a collective determination to rewrite a legacy once dominated by corruption and despair. Through it all, Maria never lost the compassion that had driven her in those early, terrifying days. She continued to visit the poorest homes in the village and beyond, listening to their grievances and comforting the afflicted. Her gentle demeanor and fierce determination bridged long-standing divides, earning her not only the admiration of former adversaries, but also the loyalty of those who had once been relegated to the margins of society. Under her leadership, what began as an uprising against a brutal criminal enterprise evolved into a comprehensive movement for social justice, a movement where victims became empowered, silenced voices sang out, and the promise of a fairer world drew ever nearer. On a cool, clear evening that marked the anniversary of her boldest defiant act, a celebration was held in the village square. Under a sky brimming with stars, Maria, now older, wiser, and immensely respected, addressed a sea of faces that shone with hope and gratitude. With a voice that carried both the weight of her painful past and the brilliance of her future, she proclaimed, "When we dare to shine a light on the darkness, even the most entrenched injustice can be overcome." Today, our struggle has not only reclaimed our dignity, it has redefined our future. We are no longer bound by the chains of exploitation, for we have become the architects of our own destiny. Her words resonated like a clarion call across the crowd. There, amid the jubilant throngs of villagers, laborers, and the newly liberated, Maria's legacy was forever sealed. The girl who had once been forced into a marriage of despair had become a beacon of empowerment, a living example that even the most painful chapters can be transformed into the foundation for a new era of justice, equality, and hope. Maria began with a desperate bid to save her brother, but her journey ignited a revolution for the rights and dignity of thousands. True strength lies not in the chains that bind you, but in the courage to break them and lead others to freedom. Subscribe if you believe that the power of truth and the courage to stand up against injustice can spark a revolution of change. And share in the comments, if you discovered a secret that could reshape your world, how would you use it to bring light to the darkness?